Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, from beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to kind of step back from Africa a little bit and focus more broadly on climate change, which obviously has a direct impact on Africa and was a very big topic this past weekend at the G20 summit, which I'd like to get your reflections on. But today we're going to be focusing on the 30th meeting of the Conference of Parties, otherwise known as COP30, that took place last week in Belém, Brazil. And Cobus, what was so interesting about both the COP30 event in Brazil and then the G20 summit in South Africa, where you are, was that the United States was absent from both. And China took on a particularly prominent role in both, in many ways, a commanding presence in both. I don't want to say they set the agenda because, again, there were a lot of parties and a lot of factions there, and it's too difficult for any one country to set the agenda. But the influence of the Chinese at both the COP30 and at the G20 was unmistakable. You could not have avoided it. What was your reflection on this little hint and little peek into maybe what a post-American order might look like?
As you were saying, they were prominent at both. I think they stepped into slightly different positions. So at the G20, as you say, it's not only that the US refused to go. I think in a lot of ways the G20 was kind of dominated by these kind of different fights between South Africa and the US. The US saying they're not going, and then they may be going, and then they're going partially, and it was kind of like, and then a big fight back and forth about how the communique is supposed to be handed over. So there was a lot of kind of like US South African issues there, and in that context, China kind of stepped in as essentially the big global South country. So symbolically linking itself to the global South, but at the same time kind of differentiating itself as a development partner. So it announced a big like Africa-focused modernization initiative with South Africa. It announced, on the sidelines also as yet kind of like undescribed what exactly it'll be, but some kind of rare earth coordination initiative where they're going to be working with a bunch of global South countries on rare earths. So China was in this very strong kind of like leadership position at the G20, I think. Similarly, it was very prominent, I think, at COP, but what was interesting for me is that it refused formally, like in statements, it refused this kind of leadership position. So, China, like Chinese negotiators were literally saying like, yeah, sure, kind of we are in this kind of prominent position, but we don't see ourselves as leaders and we want coordination with more countries. And so it was interesting, like they were also avoiding this leadership narrative that outsiders were trying to put on them.
Well, let's get some insight on China's role at the COP, and again, how it maybe surprised us a little bit, but also more broadly, what came out of the 30th COP. And for that, we're thrilled to have back on the show our old friend, Anika Patel, who is the China analyst at Carbon Brief and does some really fantastic reporting on China climate issues. And if you missed her X feed and her LinkedIn posts from COP30, they were fantastic, and we're going to put some links to that in the show notes. Anika, a very good morning to you in London.
Hi, Eric Cobus. Great to be back.
I hope you are well recovered from what looked like a very hectic time in Brazil, covering what was a very exciting COP, no doubt. Before we get into the details about China and some of the issues that Cobus touched on, maybe we can just start, for those of us who didn't follow COP as closely maybe as you have, what were some of the big takeaways, the big themes that emerged from this year's COP?
Absolutely. Brazil is a beautiful part of the world. So any kind of hardship from the million different things happening at COP was offset by how lovely the country is and how welcoming a lot of the people in a very small city were to the, I think, 50,000 plus people descending for 2 weeks. To take a step back for people who maybe aren't so familiar with the COP process and its idiosyncrasies, the really unique thing about COP and UN climate negotiations in general is that they require consensus. So that means that countries developed and developing, petrostates like Saudi Arabia to tiny island states like Vanuatu, all need to come out of 2 weeks of intense negotiations, agreeing on every single line and every single document. And there are a lot of documents this year. We were talking about fossil fuels. We were talking about adaptation financing. There was a new work program on the just transition. And then there are, several other different topics that people want to raise or states want to raise during and just before the negotiations that end up in this separate document called a cover document. It has a different name every year, but this year it's called the Mrchanism decision. So you have negotiations going on from things from finance to critical minerals to, indigenous rights and human rights. And every single country has to agree on the wording for every single one of those elements. This COP was also slightly different to previous COPs in that there wasn't really a headline topic going in. This was kind of described by COP30 CEO Anna Tony as the COP of implementation. It's about taking a lot of the kind of architecture, the kind of underpinning principles of the Paris Agreement that have been negotiated and decided on in the last 10 years, and then kind of sitting down and being like, okay, we understand what these principles are, but now we're trying to figure out how to get there. So there were some announcements coming out of COP30. There was a new kind of decision to triple adaptation finance, and again, kind of talking about how exactly we want to try and understand what adaptation finance is and really implement this. There was a bit of a dust-up over a fossil fuel roadmap that has resulted in this kind of voluntary project that the COP30 presidency is going to kind of take on in the year ahead and then eventually hand over to COP31. There was a new just transition work program that tried to kind of really scope out what does a just transition mean. And then a bunch of other kind of different work streams and different kind of topics that were raised by specific countries. So I think the ones that people may have seen headlines about are things like unilateral trade measures, critical minerals, developed kind of mechanisms and kind of more scoping of how developed countries, which under the UN is a very specific list of countries, gives to developing countries. And various different topics that maybe didn't result in an end report, but ended up in this Mrchanism decision document that was agreed on and gavelled through on the last day of COP.
So just to, recently China officially kind of renounced its developing country privileges in the World Trade Organization, which is, of course, different from the COP situation. So I was wondering where China stands in relation to developing, and the kind of north-south politics at COP specifically.
Absolutely. Yeah. When that decision was made, I did see quite a bit of chatter about what that might mean for China's status more broadly. I'm not a WTO expert. My understanding is that they're quite siloed in terms of what status in one platform might mean for another. At COP more broadly, because of the absence of the US, there was a lot of interest around how that would kind of affect developed versus developing status and the kind of like great power kind of dynamics that tend to drive through some form of consensus by the end of the COP. So previously, the US and China have often put out joint statements. Obama and Xi put out a joint statement. There was the Sunnyland statement between Biden and Xi, and that has often been seen as a signal for, alignment between the two largest emitters, but also the most kind of influential and largest developed country and the most influential and and highest emitting developing country. That, obviously, given the new Trump administration, was not on the cards this year. So there was a lot of chatter about, does this mean that China will become the new leader? Will it team up with the EU and try and kind of replicate this dynamic, this US-China dynamic? Will it partner with the BRICS countries, basic countries, other large emerging economies, and kind of push through more of like a maybe developing country COP this year, one that kind of focuses more on developing countries' priorities? China publicly very much did not want to be seen as a leader. You had the climate envoy, Liu Jianmin, earlier this year, end of last year, saying that, this was basically the West trying to impose on China a status that it did not want. I think when you're kind of at the China Pavilion at COP, the statements from senior climate and energy officials very carefully, if they mention leadership at all, it was within the context of leading on clean energy, leading in provision of, adaptation and kind of disaster response technologies and support. It wasn't necessarily putting China in this broad bucket of leading on absolutely everything to do with climate. And I think that, what they were happier about was other countries and other kind of representatives of maybe the UN or other kind of interlocutors saying, China is a leader. China is, providing so much technology and finance and kind of capacity building support to other developing countries. So it's really leading in this space, but China did not want that position themselves. I think that, my personal impression is that there may have been more space for that if there was perhaps more coordination between China and the EU at an early stage. So Chinese representatives went to Brussels, I believe, in July to kind of, or over the summer to establish this kind of China-EU joint statement on climate. It was seen as a very weak document. There's nothing really particularly detailed. There was a bit of a discrepancy between whether it was a joint statement or a joint press statement. And as you guys both know, in the Chinese contents, that kind of discrepancy does kind of very much stand out. And my understanding from what I've read and heard from others is that, if there had maybe been a bit more of a decisive emissions reduction commitment and a more decisive kind of climate leadership from the EU side, there may have been the stronger coordination, but that just didn't manifest.
Yeah, Cobus, I'd like to get your take on something here. So what Anika is saying, I think, is very much consistent with what we've seen in other parts of Chinese global governance leadership. For example, we've seen in Africa quite a bit that they want African media, African scholars to validate the global governance initiative, the global development initiative, and that gives them power and strength. And in many ways, what Anika is telling us is that's the same thing on the climate side. But this reluctance to take the lead is a little bit surprising to me, in part because of what we've seen over the past year, where China's taken a much more assertive role in global governance. Xi Jinping's speech at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization really asserting that the Global South and China in particular and the new GGI are standards for the world to follow. Obviously on security and defense and many other ways. In AI, they're talking about China becoming a norm setter. And so it's interesting that at this particular moment on climate, that they seem to be a little bit more reluctant and not as assertive as they are in other areas. Does that surprise you as much as it did me, or did you expect this?
No, I did kind of expect this, because I think the leadership, kind of designation in this is, kind of in this context becomes a lot more loaded, because it doesn't simply kind of designate China's particular leadership. It may then end up being a kind of a mechanism to shift, other like larger forms of other responsibility, kind of, because once China is a leader, quote unquote, on this, then what happens to the US? What happens to the other kind of like, kind of notable emitters, particularly in a context where they are, the Trump administration's withdrawing from Paris, and so on. So does that then set everything up for this kind of like weird parallel process? You know what I mean? So I think in the climate context, that has particular kind of issues.
And it does. Anika, does that then, based on what Cobus is saying, and Cobus, I think you're 100% right, if China took this leadership role, would that come with some liability? And China, in past COPs, has made it very clear that it sees itself as a developing country, a victim of climate change, and does not see itself as an advanced economy or an industrial economy that's been the perpetrators of climate change. And so it does not want to pay into the funds, for example, that others have had to pay. If it took that leadership role, would it then be accountable financially the same way that, say, France and Britain and the United States and the industrial economies are?
It's a good question. I think I would push back slightly on the financing point specifically, just because it's a really important point. I think that under the UN, when the Paris Agreement was decided, there was always this kind of expectation, and it's written into, we call it Article 9.1, but it's basically written into the Paris Agreement, that because of the historical role that developed countries have played in climate change, that they should be taking the lead on climate finance. And then various other legalese in the rest of that particular article then say, and developing countries should then, mobilize finance and do what they can. And that was
but
a very,
very,
very
point of contention, though, right? That the U.S. has said that China should be paying into this because they are the largest emitter, but on a per capita basis, they're quite small. But China said, no, we are a developing country. I mean, this is a real point of contention.
It is a point of contention, but one thing that actually was really interesting to me, and a very good point of comparison to COP29 last year, is that at COP29, the Chinese executive vice premier, who's basically the guy under Xi who kind of holds the whole climate portfolio in the Chinese political system, Deng Xiang, he said that he basically, in his leader's speech, talked about China's climate finance. For the very first time, he talked about how China had basically, over the course of several years, provided $24.5 billion. And the way that he talked about it, which it sounds very nitpicky, but in these kind of diplomatic negotiations, every signal is important. The way that he talked about it was using the language of climate finance as is expected by the COP process, and the kind of in the way that we talk about developed countries providing finance. So last year there was this really interesting signal that maybe there was interest in China in not necessarily, providing finance in the same way that developed countries were, but providing more finance and being happy to talk about it. That was gone this year. So this year, one of the big points that China was pushing on, together with other like-minded developing countries, so that's an official negotiating bloc that includes Saudi Arabia and India and others, they were pushing for a lot more accountability for developed countries to cough up on climate finance, with very few signals about China providing climate finance itself. And going back to the question about leadership and liability, I do think that on climate, there is this really interesting tension where, yes, China does, it's very happy to kind of talk about how it's overshot or kind of overachieved on its renewable energy installations. It's very happy to talk about being a leader in the climate space. But as Cobus was saying, a leader in the renewable energy space. But as Cobus was saying, there's a lot of areas where it wants to go at its own pace, where, there are perfectly kind of legitimate concerns from the economic perspective in terms of the coal phase out and how that's going to affect I think it's 10 or 11 million coal workers still in China. The economic impact of accelerating its energy transition towards renewables at a time where the economy is slowing down quite dramatically. And I think that Cobus was right that, having that having that kind of macro leadership role would invite a lot more scrutiny on things like the fossil phase out, where it would much prefer to say, this whole process is meant to be kind of giving countries the space to have our own sovereignty, our own nationally determined targets and goals. And we would very much like to, conduct the energy transition at our own pace.
So you mentioned the not very efficient kind of coordination between China and the EU. So one of the issues there is an initiative that's coming in, aimed at kind of balancing the EU, like the amount EU companies pay and outside companies pay for carbon mitigation, which in the form of essentially a set of levies or tariffs, on imports. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. It's the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and other related kind of like trade disputes, kind of how China and other players kind of like played into those.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of one of the areas where we actually saw a lot of movement and a lot of kind of excitement at the COP. I think COPs typically have kind of these very entrenched battle lines, and then everything kind of shifts and people compromise at the end. But the trade piece, I think, was very live throughout the whole discussions. CBAM itself is quite interesting from the China perspective, because there have been a fair number of studies, and most of the kind of Chinese civil society people I've spoken to and interlocutors I've spoken to don't necessarily think that China is that worried about CBAM. The main thing that CBAM would affect is exports of Chinese steel to the EU. And there's a whole separate anti-dumping process going on that basically renders that moot. There have also been arguments that CBAM has, helped accelerate China's own development of its own kind of carbon emissions trading system. So it's actually quite interesting to talk about unilateral measures from the Chinese perspective, because CBAM is kind of lowest on the list. It's helpful for them to kind of push on CBAM because it helps their developing country partners. But I don't necessarily think that's the biggest issue from them, just from what I've heard. The bigger issues are the other unilateral trade measures. So until very recently, that meant things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. It means EV tariffs in the EU. And I think it's also kind of in anticipation of how particularly developed countries, but also countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, and elsewhere, are starting to think about placing tariffs or other kind of import-export restrictions on Chinese-made clean technologies. So they've managed to have now these kind of, I'm going to call them UTMs, unilateral trade measures is a bit of a mouthful. These UTMs, they've managed to get that now officially considered under the COP process, which is something they've been trying to do since COP28 2 years ago. It's resulted in basically a report that will be coming out, a kind of annual dialogue that will lead to a report in 2028, and an official kind of high-level event, which basically means that other countries will be able to weigh in on, what this means. But something that is also quite interesting is there was a nugget of information in the kind of negotiations, which reporters aren't allowed into. So we have to get a lot of this from other sources. But the EU essentially was saying that, okay, great, we can include UTMs as part of the COP process, but are we going to talk about the raw materials or raw metals that are necessary for the clean energy transition and restrictions on those. And that is very clearly pointing to China's recent export restrictions on rare earths and other critical minerals for the energy transition. Yeah. So it's definitely really interesting. I think definitely going to be one of the areas where you see a lot of friction and a lot of heat in the years ahead.
Well, it's interesting because in the final communique of the G20 summit, there was a very mild, veiled critique of China and its unilateral measures to restrict rare earths exports this year. And so it seems like there's some nervousness about China in that role. I want to just pick up on one point that you brought up about these UTMs, or these trade measures that developing countries may take against Chinese green technology. Is the reason that's the case is because we talked about earlier this year on our site, our correspondent Njenga Akina did a great story on how Nigeria was trying to build its own solar panel industry and wanted to restrict the import of Chinese solar panels. But in the end, they simply could not make a solar panel at a cost competitive price. And so they removed those restrictions. But is that the reason why a lot of these developing countries potentially may want to start putting tariffs on Chinese green tech so that they can support their own domestic initiatives at producing this kind of technology?
That is consistent with what I'm hearing. I'm gonna caveat this with saying that I've not done kind of a country by country analysis, and I rely a lot of the work that you guys do and other great outlets on it. Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, India is a great example of that. They're trying to kind of build up their solar industry, EVs and others. And so you did have these kind of this back and forth where I think China wasn't issuing visas for Chinese clean tech engineers who were maybe going over to India. And then India was placing, I think, import tariffs. So, and you see that replicated in Turkey, in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. But I think that, this is a big question that a lot of countries are grappling with. I mean, first of all, from a climate perspective, we've just kind of come out of a COP where developing countries are asking for more money and developed countries are saying, we politically that's not viable for us. So if you're being given clean tech, the stuff that you need for that transition at a lower cost, should you just accept it? And should you just accept that China can do this better?
Cobus, that's been your point, is that if the Chinese taxpayer wants to subsidize solar panels for Africans, then you've said many years, yeah, bring it on. Let's do this.
Yeah, I mean, that's I tend to kind of advocate in this very kind of like basic and not trade expert kind of like way, for kind of a pragmatic kind of base level of electrification through cheap Chinese components and then building on top of that local manufacturing. But, like this is happening as in Nigeria, but also in South Africa, there are these kind of nascent solar, kind of industries trying to be built. So, and obviously, it having solar production in African countries obviously makes a lot of sense for the African market. So it's a very kind of a complicated kind of back and forth, in your own mind as well. Anika, I wonder, you briefly mentioned the building out of Chinese carbon trading mechanisms. Like shortly before COP, there was this announcement of a Brazilian-led initiative to try and kind of unite different carbon markets. And China signed up to that, on an initial level. So I was wondering whether there was any more momentum on that during the conference.
I think during the conference, not necessarily. A lot of those, so there was a methane summit between the UK and China and others. I had a look at those. I think that from my perspective, anything that kind of signals, global cooperation on these topics is definitely welcome. That particular announcement, I didn't see anything particularly tangible. It was more of an agreement to discuss. So I think that there very well may be kind of interesting, tangible cooperation on that in the years ahead, but maybe not necessarily signaled from that announcement. But I definitely think that carbon markets and kind of green finance more generally is still quite a strong area of China-Europe cooperation. So China and the UK have had a very strong partnership on green finance. China and the EU coordinate very closely on how they build out their respective carbon markets and kind of take lesson learning and knowledge sharing from that. There's also kind of joint taxonomies that China and the EU have worked on to streamline interoperability of their respective carbon markets. I think as well recently a particular kind of certificate that you get from doing carbon trading was also in China was also recognized internationally. So I think that there is a lot of movement in that space. It's still very slow. China's ETS is very much in its early stages, whereas the EU's has had quite a while to develop. But I think that, yeah, from both a global cooperation point of view, but also just in terms of, rewiring how economies, like national and global economies, work to kind of take carbon more into account and accelerate climate action it's really interesting. I think there is a fair amount of momentum there.
Just before we go, and we're just really appreciative of your time, and also the coverage that you're giving and the insights, I wanted you to share a few reflections of what it was like at the China Pavilion. And I asked this because you posted a lot of pictures on LinkedIn and X, just showing a really packed, buzzy type of space where there was just a lot of interest in what China was doing. And I'd love you to just tell us what, your personal kind of take of what it was like there. And I'm just wondering, did China get more attention because the U.S. wasn't there? Or do you think that the China Pavilion would have been just as active with or without the U.S.?
Yeah, it was an absolute blast being there. I must admit that my main takeaway is that it was very hot because the air conditioning in the China Pavilion did not work. So consistently you would see, the environment minister Huang, you'd see the head of the delegation Li Gao, all of these very well-respected and very kind of dignified officials sat at the front row trying desperately to kind of not pass out from the heat, and eventually they would cave and a little functionary would be giving out fans, and they'd be desperately fanning themselves. So that I think was maybe 60% of my brain capacity was just trying to fight the heat. But no, absolutely, as you say, I think what was really interesting to me was just the number of people from all walks of life who were there. I think that part of that is the kind of synergy between China and Brazil on the climate space. You have obviously the kind of high level BRICS and basic and that kind of high level climate links between the two, but also I was in Rio just before I went to Belém, and you could see BYDs on the street. State Grid had the little friendship plaque that Chinese companies often have at the botanical gardens in Rio. There is quite a strong presence of, Chinese investment and Chinese the Chinese energy transition in Brazil itself. And you just saw people from all walks of life. I spoke to a chemical engineer. I saw two ladies in indigenous dress sat next to me. And I think especially at the kind of south events, but even the more technical events like the event on the carbon markets or technology, you just had a lot of people who really wanted to know how China achieved what it did so quickly in terms of its renewable energy build out, in terms of kind of repositioning its economy. And a lot of people, I think, especially from developing countries, really just want to know how they can replicate that and what they can learn from that. There was someone I spoke to, a guy called Tyler. He was actually doing kind of vox popping of a lot of people on the ground from developing countries who had just shown up at the China Pavilion. And he was saying that, maybe the words ecological civilization or XXX with Chinese characteristics didn't quite resonate for people, but they still kind of you had really in-depth presentations on, okay, as from from the Chinese kind of national climate change kind of center, this is how we designed the carbon market and this is what we learned. You had someone from a Chinese think tank called the Energy Research Institute say this is how we've kind of mapped out the way that we think China's energy transition is going to go. And I think a lot of people, they might not have picked up on all of the details, but they were picking up a lot of these kind of like little bits of information that were relevant to them. And the last thing I would say is just that the goodies really helped. There were a lot of people who were in it for the nice hand-painted fans and the bits of Yunnan pu'er tea that were on display, and that China wasn't alone in that. Korea
all the giveaways, all the swag.
I do really want to see who won out, them or the K-pop Demon Hunters merch at the Korea Pavilion, but someone else is going to have to do that now.
But that does seem a little bit ironic about giving away a lot of swag in the form of cheap plastic, oftentimes at a climate conference. Does it not seem a little weird?
I mean, yeah, I haven't looked into their supply chains. Okay. Maybe they have carbon offsets. Sure. Maybe it's all recyclable.
The K-pop Demon Hunter supply chain is probably maybe not the cleanest. My suspicion there. Anika, thank you so much for your time and for all the great reporting that you've done. We're going to put links in the show notes to your you did this amazing summary, and Carbon Brief as well did a 20,000 word debrief on the whole COP30. So if you're interested in COP30 and you want to figure out what's going on, then Carbon Brief is the place to do it. We're going to put that big debrief that you showcased on your X channel, but also that's on the front page of Carbon Brief as well. Anika, thank you so much. Anika Patel is the China analyst at Carbon Brief. She's an old friend of the show, and we're thrilled to have you back again and look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you both. This has been an absolute pleasure.
It's always fun to talk to Anika because she does interpret what is a very technical process in very accessible language. That being said, I don't really pay attention to COP30 that much. I didn't really read that much about it when it went on. I didn't pay attention to COP29. I didn't pay attention to COP28. I find, honestly, the whole COP process a little bit fatiguing, where there's so much back and forth. And at the end of the day, when you see the United States, the world's largest polluter, isn't going to pay, isn't participating, you see the wealthy countries barely made their pledges for climate justice and climate finance and climate equity. At the end of the day, I remain convinced that people in wealthy countries are not going to significantly compromise their lifestyle for the benefit of you in South Africa and people in Brazil. And by the way, here in Southeast Asia this past week, if you haven't been following the news, devastating floods, 90 dead in Vietnam. It's just horrific what's been happening here in Southeast Asia. Floods that are larger than we've ever seen before. And yet, at COP, there's just 50 billion pages of text and agreements that are done, and every year emissions go up. Every year it just feels like it gets worse and worse. I just don't have a lot of faith in this system. And I don't know if that's misplaced or not. I know a lot of people do, but it just feels like a lot of futile bargaining.
Well, you have to keep in mind that the aim of all of this, of the COP process, is nudging these countries towards coordination, right? So it's not like these are commitments, but they're not. No one is being prosecuted if they miss this commitment. It has to be a voluntary commitment that has to make sense within the local context. But like that's the best we have, right? Kind of, because how are you going to compel these countries to do things? So that's the so it's an imperfect process. But like when one looks at the large trajectory of the COPs over 30 years, we have seen kind of like the amounts of, like, as you say, the emissions keep going up, but the emissions are going up a lot slower than they used to. Like at the moment we're on course for about 2.5 degrees centigrade of warming, which is disastrous. I mean, 2.5 means full bleaching of all coral. It means like loss of most forests.
That's what they said was disaster. Was 2.5 degrees, right?
But when one looked at kind of a bunch of years ago at earlier COPs, we were then on course for 6 degrees of warming. Okay. So so there is a movement, but the problem is that we need to move so much, and that this is a very painful kind of like 3 steps forward, 4 steps back kind of process. Yeah. Like it's chaotic and increasingly more difficult because of the US and because of other disruptions.
Well, one of the things that I took away from this COP in the little coverage that I did and listening to Anika was the fact that it felt like China was in a different place this time. It felt like China assumed a bigger leadership role. And just listening to what Anika was saying about the soft power that China is transmitting through its new energy exports, through its new energy vehicles, and through its role as the largest producer of clean energy in the world, is a very interesting form of soft power. And we've talked about this before, that China's infrastructure example, a country that in our lifetimes, Cobus, was poorer than most African countries and today is the second largest economy in the world. Again, a lot of people think that's a kind of tired old talking point, but when you are sitting in a developing country, you look at that and you think, wow, they did it, so that means it's possible and we can do it. Now that seems to be done also in a green energy context as well. If they can convert as much of their fossil fuel energy production to new energy production, then it's possible for Brazil, for Vietnam, for South Africa as well.
Yeah, I mean, one has to say, just jokingly, if that story of China's, movement from a very, very poor country to the second largest economy, if that's a tired story, what is the global North's story then? Kind of like zero development on anything over the last 30, 40 years. Great. Like that's a fantastic story. I think this is a very interesting thing for me, like an interesting trend for me, because it kind of overlaps with kind of soft power and like nation branding and so on, work that I do more broadly. But I think if one steps out, I mean, one kind of gives yourself the permission to talk in very kind of like simplistic kind of terms. Like what I think is interesting is that of all of these different visions of the world, China, for all of the ways that it's problematic, is the only country, the only significant country that provides any kind of view of the future. Like, kind of the US has really shifted in a very fully kind of backward looking in all directions, right? Like openly kind of nostalgic for the past. But also the EU, despite the EU is steps up more, in terms of futuristic kind of imaging. But almost all of that is also in a kind of a narrative of, it's a kind of like it's not an open sharing narrative, right? Kind of like that entire kind of narrative is one of EU regime survival, EU kind of like future, kind of stability and so on, which is usually couched within the larger kind of like European logic in different kinds of ways of either keeping out global South stakeholders or managing them, kind of in a way that also benefits the EU. So, kind of for all of the different problems in China's vision, China really is the only vision of providing a rough kind of roadmap to what an inclusive actual survival future could maybe look like. So that is some Chinese soft power development, but that is also a massive kind of failure on the part of everyone else, right? Like we need a lot more kind of like future looking visions, right? And we just don't have them. And China's the only one that actually provides any kind of like concrete idea of what that could look like.
Yeah, and was also a final reflection on this past week of both the COP30 and the G20, where the United States wasn't there. And again, I don't think most Americans have any appreciation of this because they're so consumed with everything that's going on, the Epstein files, Venezuela. I mean, there's just so much going on in the U.S. that they don't pay attention to these kinds of things. But it really started to make the U.S. look small and increasingly irrelevant, that you're not at the table. And that old saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I really started to feel that for the first time in my life, the U.S. started to feel small and increasingly marginalized. And I think that's going to be something we see more of. But when the U.S. pulled out and just isn't participating, and I would make the argument that even in the Biden administration, and you've talked about Biden in Africa, for example, was a lot of rhetoric, but very little on substance. And Biden on climate, with the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the other things, was rather substantive. So the U.S. was at the table and was contributing to this discourse. That's not the case anymore. And it was an interesting observation to make, that this is what this huge power, this massive transformational power in modern history started to look very small for the first time in my lifetime.
It's true, but it's I think it's an even more radical situation than that, because it's not only that they withdrew themselves, or that there was kind of an America-shaped gap there, which there was, but it was also that they are actively working in the opposite direction, right? Kind of, it's they're putting, like, the America remains a huge power. It remains incredibly strong, but it's putting its strength in pulling us in the opposite direction than the rest of the world is trying to pull in this direction, as fractious as the processes are, So that then, it's not only that the US isn't there. The question is a lot more, what is the US's global role then? Kind of like, so, like just taking, the US economy, fossil fuels role in that economy, the philosophical discussions role, all of that, just taking that off the table for the moment and just asking the larger question of, like, how is the rest of the world supposed to think of the US's global power and the US's global contribution in this context? You said, like, so the US is not at the table. I don't tend to think that the US is on the menu in a way, because no one has that kind of power over them. So then, if they're not either of those two, what are they? Like, are they busy? Like, they're almost like they're in the back of the restaurant trying to convince the chef to put roadkill on the table or something. I don't know. Like, I don't know what the US's role is. Like, it's just kind of like, it's just, they, like, shaking down the restaurateur for protection money. I have no idea. Like, kind of like, in that kind of restaurant metaphor, like, where does the US stand? And I think the fact that, and that's a huge question because of the huge power of the US. So, so we need new language for this, I think.
Yeah, but Cobus, I don't think there's a lot of mystery to that. I mean, the administration has been very clear, and the president has been very clear, drill, baby, drill, that the United States is the largest fossil fuel producer in the world and wants to remain so. And it wants to roll back clean energy vehicles. It wants to roll back clean energy mandates on energy, on, solar and other things. And it wants to be a fossil fuel superpower, which it is. That's its role. That's it. Full stop. It doesn't want to be anything else. I mean, the government, not necessarily the people, but the government's position is fossil fuels.
And we should say that one of the places in the world that's putting in by far the most solar power in the world is Texas,
the Saudis,
right?
And Saudi Arabia, by the way, ironically.
Saudi Arabia as well, but Texas specifically, right? Kind of so like in kind of like a Republican stronghold in a Republican government. Even as they're pulling in this one direction, they're also pulling in the other direction, and we have to acknowledge that. But the thing is then, that goes with this kind of like no future kind of feeling, right? Kind of so the feeling is, if so the second paragraph after what you just said, right, kind of is then, okay, so the US is now fully put its power into a death cult, because everyone knows where fossil fuels are going, right? So so the US is now fully putting it,
a lot of Americans don't believe that, though.
Yeah, but what I mean is, like, are they, like, even if fossil fuels continue, then that's the death of us all, right? Kind of, so the US is on board with the death of us all. That's what I mean by the death cult thing, right? Kind of, is that, like, the US is fully leaning into the death and suffering of people around the world, which, okay, so, it's like noted. So that's kind of opposite of soft power, right? Kind of like, what is,
They've not been, I mean, let's just be fair here. The well-being of people around the world has not been the concern of the Trump administration. Otherwise, they wouldn't have killed USAID, where hundreds of thousands and over the next 5 years, millions of people will die as a result of the cut of U.S. foreign assistance, the sudden, abrupt cut of U.S. foreign assistance. And I guess my point here is that you're trying to say that as in some way to guilt them into this. They don't care. They've been very, very upfront about it. And they've been intellectually consistent on it, too, by the way. Like, they don't care if you die from climate change or from the lack of antiretroviral drugs that could save your life. And let's be very clear here. A sizable portion of the people dying from the lack of USAID assistance are children. So, but it's not a concern. It really is not a concern.
But then, so just to pursue that then, so does that really fully mean that the US is giving up on its global role?
They have been very upfront about America first. That is the brand, right? So I don't know. The manifesto is pretty clear. It's America first, everybody else second. So I think we are in that stage. And again, that's not reading between the lines on this. That's literally what they say. So I think if you listen to Steve Bannon, you listen to Trump, you listen to any of the MAGA wing, they're concerned, what happens in Brazil, what happens in South Africa is not their concern.
So it's a kind of a smaller world kind of vision, right?
That's right. And that's exactly it. And that's why I
kind
feel
of illusion
that
they can withdraw from the world. Yeah.
That's right. And this is the opening that China's taking full advantage of that we saw this past couple of weeks. Okay, well, let's leave our conversation there. We veered off into a U.S. angle there, which I hadn't intended, but it's the world we live in, right? Cobus, thank you so much for your time today, as always. And if you want to follow the coverage that Cobus, Giraud, and the rest of the team are doing at the China Global South Project, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. And if you want to support the work that we're doing, we would so appreciate if you subscribe, ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions are very affordable. And if you are a student or teacher, please email me, Eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the link for a half-off discount code. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, for Cobus van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening and for watching.